Welcome, everybody. This is Sociology of the Family Weeks 2 and 3. This is a little presentation I've developed that what it will do. Why am I doing this? We've looked at and examined in week 2, or at least in week 1, actually. Week 1, part 2, it would be for your 12-week class. But we've looked at sociological theories, and you had a quick run through of them, and now we're in week 2 and we're looking at research methods, what we do to do research. And sometimes that research is applied. That will be there'll be some application that will be useful to those of you who are going into some sort of counseling or therapeutic applications of family work. If you're working with people, you're going to need to know, some paradigms and what has worked and what has not worked in terms of approaches of assessing a situation. And then for those of us who are sociologists or in some related observational field, we are tasked with doing sort of baseline research from which we can develop rigorous testable hypotheses or do observations. So both of these aspects are important. They're recursive. In other words, one informs the other. Today, though, we're going to look at how theory links with methods. Okay? So let's look at some of the global functions of the family. I've been grading your papers, and many of you have I think, correctly identified this from the readings. We look at families not in terms of incumbents, whether they're children or not, or mom and dad. Sometimes there's two dads or two moms, right? Sometimes it's a single parent. Sometimes there's there's a marriage or a relationship and no children, okay? Sometimes they're extended family members, grandparents or cousins, right? But we want to look not at that as much as we look at what we call global functions of a family. From the anthropological literature, we know that there are no cultures in which there's no such thing as a family, okay? I mean, what's deviant, varies from culture to culture. Economic realities and social interactions and political situations are highly variable from society to society. But every society, both historically and currently, has some definition of what a family is. So what are some of the fundamental functions of a family? First, economic support. It's where resources are either generated, in the case of agricultural societies, combined or recombined to support everyone in a family. Emotional support, intimacy, companionship, a sense of belonging. When there are children, the socialization process, that's personality formation, the dynamic aspect of it. And it's essential for every human being. Raising children and parenting, but more fundamental than that, without socialization, you can't fully become human. A family is a place you're going to first learn language, which is essential for intellectual development. It's actually writ onto our biology. The amount of, we're very plastic between the ages of 0 and 5, and we can actually measure how much interaction people in our families have with us. It has an actual impact on neurological development. Okay, we know that now. That's a recent development and an exciting one. Control of sexuality is, again, we draw on the anthropological literature. It defines and controls when and with whom people have sexual intimacy, marriage. In anthropology, historically, we've looked at incest taboos. It defines who, when, and with whom we do not have relationships. And of course, this is expanded to include in the United States as of 2015, same-sex couples, right? Control of reproduction. What relationships, which children should be born or brought into via adoption. But again, anthropologically, the incest taboo controls, for example, forbids marriage between close relatives, right? And a family is a place that's defined. It both defines and defines the context in which we are socialized, at least from the very beginning. It's the fundamental baseline. We call it institutional arrangement. Now, what's an institution? In sociology and in social sciences, an institution is any way that humans organize to meet basic human needs. And your family is both historically and for us as individuals the first place that this happens. So, context of race, socioeconomic status, religion, kinship ties are all ascribed statuses. So what's an ascribed status? An ascribed status is given to children by their families because it is a type of status that is present at birth. With your friends, have you noticed that one or two tend to be informally in charge of the details? You might be the one who calls everyone and makes reservations or buys the tickets for others. So you would have the informal role of organizer. A status is socially defined position, or what you do in a role. There are three types of status considerations. We have ascribed statuses. They're present at birth, race, sex, social class, and then age, ability or disability. Some would argue sexuality. An achieved status is attained through one's choices and efforts. You're a college student. You're a teacher. You are a worker, okay? And a master status stands out above our other statuses and distracts others from seeing whom we really are. You are born into your racial, cultural, ethnic, religious, and economic statuses. These are shaped to some degree the way you grew up and were socialized. By far, and in modern societies, achieved status, which comes as a result of your own efforts, is more important than ascribed status, which you're born with, for most members of our society. However, the degree of achievement you attain often depends heavily on the level of support your family gives to you. Another consideration about roles is the fact that one single role can place a rather heavy burden on you. For example, student, that would be role strain, okay? That's the role, the strain one feels within any given role. For example, if you are a student and you have 3 classes and there's a test in every class on the same week, you'd be experiencing role strain. Role conflict is a conflict and burdens one feels when the expectations of one role compete with the expectations of another role usually in terms of time allocation, time resources. You're a student, an employee, and a parent, perhaps. So, families are groups. This is a social aspect of a family, right? A family is a group. 2 or more people who share a common identity, interact regularly, have shared expectations, and function in their mutually agreed upon roles. Okay? Notice we're talking about a lot about identification, self-identification, function. So there's 2 ways of measuring groups and families. Again, group size and group function, placing a family squarely in a sociological analysis. Group size has to do with quite simply with how many people are in a group. A dyad is a group with 2 people. A triad is a group with 3 people. And then we have larger groups, networks, groups where people have comparatively fewer ties. families often we have family networks. A lot of communities have families where their family reunions, where all the cousins come around and so forth. So group function, a primary group has close, intimate ties, and it is about system maintenance. We can usually place a family squarely in this primary group status. And it's its own reason for existing. For example, your family of origin, you and your partner, your spouse, your marriage, family of affiliation. We'll talk about families of affiliation, right? Those are people whom you might define as family, even though they're not, it's not consanguinal. It's another term for blood or a legal, that would be marriage, right? Okay. We contrast a family and put it in institutional linkages with a secondary group, more distant ties, a goal orientation. Whereas a family is a means, it's not a means to an end; it's an end in and of itself. Secondary groups, such as this class, for example, are a means to an end. Many of you identified in your introductory comments that you're required to take this class. So this is class is a secondary group. It's a means to an end. It's embedded in a larger secondary group that would be Sinclair Community College, right? So what are some examples? Okay, the BMV, this class, the Academic Advising Office. These are secondary groups. And indeed, families as primary groups and secondary groups, they exist as subsystems within a larger system where all the components interact, right? So, this is a diagram from your text about families in social institutions. Again, note how your family affiliation is recursive. That is, it is affected and affects all of those other social arrangements. You might be the first person in your family to go to college. You might be from a wealthy family. You might have a family where everyone works, and a family member watches the kids. You might come from a religious family or a non-religious family. Families are embedded in this interconnected social structure of social institutions. A social institution is a way that humans organize themselves. This is the definition of a social institution. Families are the oldest form of social institutional arrangement that we have. They used to do everything. Think about how and why families existed before the industrial era. In the United States, that begins about 1870 after the Civil War, right? They produced their own food, clothing, and the family was basically where all of these functions take place. So the question is, what do families do in terms of function in contemporary society? They basically exist for what sociologists term a backstage area. This comes from the sociologist Irving Goffman, where systems maintenance can take place. Now, parenthetically, here is where we're going to look at, you may consider, if you're going into an applied field, this backstage area is where function happens, but we also must acknowledge dysfunction. Just because we're giving a sort of baseline ideal type of function doesn't mean that there's not plenty of dysfunction, perhaps in our own families, or in the families that we're going to be, looking at in terms of perhaps a client-therapist relationship. Okay, that backstage area is key. Is it functioning or not? That's a consideration for an applied, approach to this analysis of family work. Okay. And it's very much, we'll talk about this in a moment, a micro application. Okay. Basically, systems maintenance takes place on a micro. What does this mean? You don't have to maintain relatively rigid role behaviors as you have at work. And this can be for better or worse. You can relax your role presentation. Note that this isn't ideal. There are some dysfunctional contexts in which this takes place in ways that don't contribute to function, or it doesn't take place. Because families are also places where economic resources are recombined in contemporary society. So we study families using sociology because we see how personal troubles are actually public issues. This is from a man named Irving Goffman. Okay. No, I'm sorry. Irving Goffman was a person who looked at front stage and backstage behaviors. This is from C. Wright Mills, who analyzed this. In other words, if for example, one is looking at an addict and how their addiction is dysfunctional for their immediate family, one can place this in a larger context. That's certainly a personal trouble, and it's a trouble. It's an individual and a family kind of personal trouble issue. Families often are faced with painful decisions about having to isolate someone because of their behavior, etc. These are also public issues. We've had, an opioid crisis in this country for a few years that it seems to be spiraling out of control. Okay. So here's some sociological theories. There are four of them that we're going to cover. Or we're going to cover actually five, but here are four to get us started. Conflict theory, structural functional theory, symbolic interaction, and exchange theory. Okay. All of these, notice that two of these are what we call macro level, or big patterns, and two of these happen at a micro level. So, first we look at is conflict theory. Conflict theory starts off with a premise that families are sites where people have unequal access to resources. Social class, differences in race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality, or any other category where one category of family has preferential access to resources versus other families. What are some examples of this? LGBT families prior to marriage equality could not gain access to legal and tax breaks accorded modal straight families. Modal means the one that occurs the most. African American families unequal access to mortgages controlling for all of their characteristics in comparison to European American families. And single parent families access to child care resources are all potential lines where there's inequality between families. A structural functional analysis, we can look at a large-scale way of meeting human needs. If you see the earlier slide on social institutions, you'll get a good baseline of that. Functions are processes for meeting these needs. Here's some examples. A family might be large. A family might have a need for identity, cohesion, family identity. That would be structure. In terms of a lot of African American communities and how families are embedded, there are family reunions that are salient institutional arrangements. Okay. It reverses this legacy of its grounded in history. It reverses this legacy of slavery and attempts to eliminate family identity. These family reunions reinforce family identity. And they've been a sort of institutional arrangement within the larger African American community for 150 years or more. So these are families are places for coordinating resources. So, a symbolic interaction. Meaning in families is constructed through symbolic symbols, or symbols, that's redundant, language and other symbol systems. Examples. What it means to be the first person in your family to go to college in a family where this has not been the norm. Writing meaningful wedding vows in a wedding versus using generic ones. Or family rules or norms for how to navigate political discussions at holiday gatherings. These are things that now we don't go into these because they're micro level analyses. We're going to have to do some, for an analysis to happen, we have to do some observations or some interviews. A lot of what we call qualitative research in sociology. Finally, exchange theory, microanalysis, is something we look at in marriage and the family, particularly in terms of courtship or how people get together. It's predicated on a sort of microeconomic belief that there's individual cost-benefit analysis based on an economic model. An individual's going to ask, what will this cost me versus how will I benefit? I'll give you a couple of examples. One has to do with dating. People decide whether to use online dating services to initiate possible romantic encounters or intimate relationships, right? People are increasingly doing this, and it is increasingly legitimate, right, with its own fraught sorts of challenges, too. I will talk later on about my own research in analyzing people's experiences with online dating. And then I know this from just from informal conversations. Women in their late 60s and early 70s having to weigh moving out of their houses or pressure thereof and retiring to take care of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren versus continuing to work and having autonomous living arrangements. I've talked to perhaps 3 women who face this kind of challenge. They were being pressured by their adult children to come, hey, move in, help with the kids. The answer in both cases was no, I don't think so. But it could be otherwise. So what bring all of these 4 theories are good, but a good theory should explain the most. Okay, a good theory should explain. It should be a theory that it is the most all-encompassing in terms of a paradigm. So, family systems theory in our analysis of the family meets this need nicely. Okay. It incorporates elements of all of these prior theories and it acknowledges the possibility for any one of those particular theories to explain some component of a family. And it looks at a family in terms of an interconnected system of components, within the family that's affected by the environment, that larger institutional environment in which a family is embedded. And it also talks about how boundaries are established. What's the boundary of a family? Often in microsociology, we talk about boundary maintenance. Who's in a group versus who's not. That's where we get to family affiliation. Many of you said you identified people that you've been close to over the years as being like family. We often say that, even more so than our own families. Sometimes this happens. Okay. So one of the key ways in which family formation takes place, but not necessarily the only way, is marriage. So what's a marriage, basically? We look at marriage because, in terms of this, it's an exclusive intimacy that only includes you and your spouse, okay? Spouse-only issues, where there are decisions, advice, and discussions that are held exclusively between partners and intentionally not between other family and friends. They include types of birth control, how to run a budget, sexual techniques and practices, whether, in the case of same-sex marriages, whether to adopt, who might be at fault in an argument. We have a diagram here, and it's a modal heterosexual family, but it could just as easily be a same-sex couple or a cohabitating couple, a married couple, all sorts of variability there. But notice the boundary, okay? So, for example, it's often said that, if there are situations about raising children, in a family, that the husband and wife have these conversations privately before they take that out of that barrier, right? Notice that there are boundaries here. This is where family system theory comes in. I mean, there's boundaries within boundaries, okay? And notice we have, if you look here, you have boundaries, the boundaries that there's a spouse, and we have the children, and then another kind of boundary around that, and then a whole, other people within extended family and people not in the family, co-workers, friends, etc. Okay. This is a good way of looking at a function of marriage, for example, how it establishes its legally established union. And it's the formal state license and legal union between people, okay? Cohabitation is informal and based on simply sharing a residence. Heterosexual, bisexual, or same-sex moving in together of two partners without going through the formalities of legal marriage. Monogamy is two spouses, one man or one woman, one or two men or two women, form a union, right? Polygamy is a marriage form, and here we dip into the anthropological literature a bit for comparison. As permitting more than one spouse at the same time, and there's two forms of this. Polygyny is marriage, a form permitting a husband to have more than one wife at the same time, and is the most common form of polygamy in the world's history. Polyandry is much rarer. It is one wife with multiple husbands, okay? It's very rare. It's only practiced among Tibetan exiles in Nepal. Usually what happens is marriage is an economic union, not necessarily just a sexual or an emotional one. We tend to term it that way. That's why this seems a little icky, maybe, this polyandry. How it works is interesting. I mean, basically, you have one wife with multiple husbands. The husbands are usually brothers. And in a kind of unusual twist that acknowledges the functionality of families over family form, the younger brother can take a wife of his own. Polyandrous monogamy, it's called. This is kind of mind-melting. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. The person who studied polyandry, who was the 20th century's greatest expert on it, was a man... and you look on the title, you go to the library and you see the title, the author was a fellow who was an anthropologist. He had a PhD from Oxford, I think. And his name was Prince Paul of Greece and Denmark. That was his actual name. He was a prince. He was an heir to, in Denmark and Greece, there were kings and queens, and they married, as people did in Europe. And so, but there was a movement in the mid-20th century as these monarchies came to an end for these guys, hey, go out and get a real job, okay? And so Prince Paul of Greece and Denmark applied himself rigorously in his academic pursuits and became the world's leading expert on this very strange marital form. One wife with multiple husbands, right? So what are marriage patterns and divorces? Those are interesting asides, but most people, are polygyny exists, or one husband and multiple wives, you have to be able to afford to maintain that sort of a household. The onus is on the husband to financially maintain the household, right? So it is, even in societies where that's allowed, is becoming comparatively rare. Modal marriage and divorce patterns in the U.S., serial monogamy, is a process of establishing an intimate marriage or a cohabiting relationship that eventually dissolves and is followed by another intimate marriage or cohabiting relationship that eventually dissolves in a series. Now, this explains divorce data. It's a methodological question. You often hear conservative commentators saying that marriage and traditional marriage is collapsing in the U.S. Just look at the divorce rate. But they're not taking into consideration, or what they're doing, they're not taking into consideration is the unit of analysis. Now, unit of analysis is what we are studying. Are we studying individuals or marriages? If our unit of analysis is people getting married, then the marriage pattern is stable. Most people who get married, in other words, stay married in the United States. And this has been a relatively stable pattern since about 1980. If our unit of analysis is marriages, then at least a percentage of them are from people practicing serial monogamy. That is, a person marrying once and divorcing and then marrying again, and then usually that, getting divorced is a great predictor of getting divorced again. I know you probably know someone, who's been divorced and remarried and their marriage has been stable. Yes, but we can't read anecdotal evidence or exceptions to patterns into what we're looking at. So here's a breakdown of marital status as of, I think this is about 9-year-old data, from the textbook, but there hasn't been a massive variation. So about 52% of people are married, about 6% widowed, divorced, separated, never married, and single, and that category. And then we have cohabitors, people that live together. The never married and single category, incidentally, is the one that is increasing. So the median age at first marriage is a great predictor at marriage stability and longevity, okay? And we see here from about 1890 to 2013, we see basically men and women are getting married later in life. And indeed, the greater the age at which you marry, is the more likely you are to stay married, up to a point. If you've been single until you're about 45 or so, and then you get married, those tend to end in divorce, but they're really comparatively rare. So, education is a predictor of marriage duration, okay? If we look over here at college, okay, here's percent marrying, percent still in first marriage, here is the green, and percent ever divorced. So people with college, with bachelor's degrees tend to stay married, and stay in their first marriages, okay? Education is a strong predictor of marriage duration. So how do we sum all this up? Okay. No one theory is going to explain everything about families. Theories derive from explanatory goals. If I'm going to know, how best to maybe advise or recommend a line of action towards somebody who's maybe having a problem, maybe with substance abuse or with, mental illness or something like that in a family. Your explanatory goals are gonna be different than if I'm looking at large scale divorce patterns. You're gonna draw though on the literature that where the scientific method has been applied to see, does this fit, does your case, and often when we're doing treatments, we're looking at case studies versus larger patterns, which a sociologist would look at. What's our goal? All theories have some usefulness. Again, it depends on your question. So operationalization is defining what you're measuring. And it's necessary because of family definitions. You all have already done that in your second discussion that we had that was due, which I'm grading now. It identifies patterns, not static roles, okay? Methods derived from theories. And family systems theory seems to be the most it's the most general, but it's the most useful in explaining most in terms of what's going on. For application, always be mindful of exceptions or particularities. Okay. So I hope this has been useful. This linking of our second and third topics together. It will serve you well to keep this in mind as we start early now. Okay. Hopefully you're considering what you're going to be working on for your paper. Okay. Thank you very much.